wine glass shattered against the wall before Annie even understood what was happening. "Are you cheating on me?" Jimin's voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. When Jimin raised his voice, people ran. When he went quiet like this, people disappeared. Annie froze at the kitchen island, her hands still wet from washing dishes. "Jimin, what?" He threw the photographs across the marble counter, one by one, like he was dealing cards in a game she didn't know she was playing. Her, walking into a hotel lobby. Her, laughing over dinner with a man in an expensive suit. Her, getting into a black car at midnight, his hand brushing her lower back. "I believe you've been having an affair," Jimin said. "For months." "That's not." "Jimin, look at me. Those photos don't tell you anything. There's a real story here, and it is not what you think." He wasn't listening. His jaw was tight, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them, and Annie had seen this man order things done to people that she chose not to think about at night. She never imagined she'd be on the receiving end of that stillness. His phone rang, his mother's name lit up the screen. He stepped into the hallway to take it. Annie heard fragments, Korean, low, controlled, and when he came back into the room, something in him had already left her. He placed a folder on the counter, next to the shattered glass. Divorce papers. 3 years. Gone in the time it took him to sign his name. Annie looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the man who used to memorize her coffee order, and put his body between her and danger without thinking twice. "Someone wants you to believe I betrayed you," she said quietly, "and you're letting them win." Jimin signed the papers anyway. Neither of them knew the affair was never the real target. Someone wasn't trying to destroy a marriage. They were trying to steal an empire. 3 years earlier. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that subscribe button. You do not want to miss what's coming. Quick question before we dive into how it all started. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Seoul had never felt like home to Annie Carter. Not until the night she walked into it and everything changed. She was 26, already running the West Coast expansion of her family's logistics empire, the one her grandfather built from a single delivery truck in Atlanta into a company that now moved freight across 3 continents. She'd flown into Seoul for a shipping conference, exhausted, jet-lagged, and completely unprepared for the man who would upend her carefully controlled life. "You're in my seat," he said. Annie looked up from her laptop. The man standing over her table wore a suit that probably cost more than her flight, and he had the kind of face that made people forget what they were about to say. "I don't see a name on it," she said. "There doesn't need to be a name on it. Everyone in this room knows whose seat it is." "Well, I'm not from this room," Annie said, "so sit somewhere else." He almost smiled. Almost. That was Jimin, heir to what remained of a once untouchable Korean shipping dynasty, though Annie wouldn't learn until much later that shipping was the polite word people used, and that his family's real business ran through darker channels than anything on a manifest. He sat across from her anyway. By the end of that dinner, Annie had laughed twice. Genuinely laughed, not the polite laugh she gave investors. And Jimin had asked her 4 questions about her grandfather's company that no one had bothered to ask in years. "Why do you care so much about a trucking company from Atlanta?" she asked him. "Because you talk about it like it's alive," Jimin said. "Most people talk about money like it's a number. You talk about it like it's family." "It is family." "I know," he said. "That's rare." They dated in secret at first, not because Annie wanted secrecy, but because Jimin insisted on it, and something in his voice when he said, "Not yet," told her not to push. Seoul in autumn. Han River walks at 11 p.m. because that was the only time he could disappear from his security detail. Annie remembers asking him once, half joking, "Are you in the Mafia or something? Why do you need security to eat noodles with me?" Jimin didn't laugh. "My family has enemies," he said. "Old ones. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Let's just enjoy the noodles, Annie." She let it go. She shouldn't have. 8 months in, he proposed on a rooftop overlooking the city. No cameras, no crowd, just Jimin on one knee looking more nervous than she'd ever seen a man who once negotiated a shipping contract without blinking. "I don't know how to protect you from everything my name comes with," he told her, "but I know I don't want to survive any of it without you." Annie said yes before he finished the sentence. Her best friend Denise was not as thrilled. "Annie, baby, listen to me." Denise's voice was flat over video call, the way it got when she meant business. "Love doesn't fix families that already decided they hate you before they meet you." His mother hasn't even met me yet. Exactly my point. Denise? I'm serious, Annie. You are about to marry into old money, old grudges, and old secrets. That's not a rom-com. That's a hostage situation with a ring. Annie laughed it off then. She would think about that conversation 100 times over the next 3 years. But wait, here's where it gets complicated. Jimin's mother, Madame Cho, arrived at the engagement dinner wearing a smile so perfectly constructed it looked painted on. Annie, she said, taking both of Annie's hands, what a beautiful name. American? Yes, ma'am, Atlanta. How refreshing. A pause, just a half-second too long. Jimin has always liked things that are different. Jimin's younger sister, Soyeon, didn't even bother with the performance. She looked Annie up and down once at the dinner table, said nothing, and spent the rest of the night speaking rapid Korean to her mother that Annie couldn't follow, but didn't need to. She understood contempt in any language. Annie noticed. Of course she noticed. She just chose not to see it. The wedding was beautiful. Traditional Korean elements blended with a southern reception Annie insisted on, complete with her grandmother's peach cobbler recipe served beside the wedding cake. Jimin wore his family's ceremonial hanbok. Annie wore her mother's altered wedding dress, the one thing she had left of a woman who passed before she could see her daughter build an empire of her own. Madame Cho gave a toast. Every word was gracious. Every word felt rehearsed. To Jimin, she said, raising her glass, and to the woman who has captured his heart so completely, he forgot to consider what our family needs. The room laughed politely. Annie's smile didn't move, but something behind her ribs went cold. Jimin squeezed her hand under the table. Ignore her, he whispered. She'll come around. Annie wanted to believe him. She always wanted to believe him. The first year of marriage tested that belief more than she expected. Madame Cho insisted on hosting monthly family dinners, formal affairs where Annie was expected to sit quietly while business was discussed in Korean she was still learning, catching maybe one word in 5. So-yeon would occasionally translate for her, always the least flattering version of whatever had been said, always with a small, satisfied smile. She said your Korean is improving, So-yeon told her once, after a particularly long exchange with their mother. Annie later learned, from a cousin who felt sorry for her, that Madame Cho had actually said something closer to the "She'll never truly be one of us, but at least she tries." Annie never told Jimin. She didn't want to be the wife who complained about his family before they'd even had a real chance. She told herself it would get better with time, that grief and suspicion softened once people knew you were staying. She was half right. It got quieter. It never got warmer. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, it only gets more insane from here. 3 years passed. On the surface, everything about Annie and Jimin's marriage looked like a fairy tale that had survived the odds. A black American heiress and a Korean shipping heir, defying 2 families, 2 continents, 2 entirely different worlds. But underneath that surface, cracks had already begun to split the foundation wide open, and neither of them saw it coming. 3 years into the marriage, from the outside, everything about the Han shipping dynasty looked untouchable. From the inside, it was drowning. Jimin sat alone in his office at 2 a.m., the blue glow of his laptop the only light in the room, staring at numbers that refused to change no matter how many times he recalculated them. 3 failed shipping routes, 2 defaulted loans, a fleet half the size it had been when his father ran the company, and creditors who no longer bothered hiding their impatience. His phone buzzed. Another message from a bank he owed money to. He silenced it and rubbed his eyes. He hadn't told Annie any of this. Not because he didn't trust her, he told himself that every night, but because some part of him, the part shaped by a father who taught him that weakness gets you replaced, couldn't stand the idea of his wife seeing him fail. "I'll fix it," he muttered to the empty room. "I always fix it." But this time, the numbers weren't cooperating. Annie, meanwhile, was thriving, and that was its own kind of complicated. Her company had just secured a distribution deal that tripled their Asia-Pacific reach, and the man responsible for making it happen was her business partner, David Osei, a sharp, soft-spoken Ghanaian-British logistics strategist she'd recruited 2 years earlier. "You're going to make us both rich," David told her over coffee, sliding a contract across the table. "Or at least make you richer. I'm just along for the ride." Annie laughed. "You're the one who found the route through Busan nobody else saw. I found it. You're the one who convinced the Port Authority to actually trust an outsider. That's the hard part." Their meetings became frequent, late dinners to accommodate different time zones, Phone calls that ran long because the conversation kept veering from spreadsheets to genuine friendship. Annie thought nothing of it. Denise, of course, had opinions. "You spend more hours with David than you do with your own husband," Denise said one afternoon, watching Annie type furiously on 2 devices at once. "I'm just saying." "It's business, Denise." "I know it's business. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm saying Jimin might not see it that way if he's already stretched thin at home. Men get weird when they feel replaced, even by a spreadsheet." Annie waved her off. "Jimin trusts me." "Trust and insecurity aren't the same animal, baby. One lives in the head, the other lives in the gut, and guts don't listen to logic." Annie laughed it off, the way she'd laughed off Denise's warning about the wedding years earlier. She had no idea how much weight those words would carry in a few short months. Someone else was watching far more closely than Denise ever could. But wait, here's where it gets messy. Madame Cho had eyes everywhere. It was a habit from decades of protecting a family whose enemies didn't always announce themselves. And what those eyes brought back to her about Annie's business dinners landed on her desk with the precision of a loaded gun. "She's spending more nights with that man than with my son," Madame Cho said to CEO Yeon, sliding a folder of photographs across the table. Hotel lobbies, candlelit dinners, a hand on a lower back that could be read 100 innocent ways, or one very convenient way. So-yeon flipped through them slowly, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter what's actually happening? Or just what it looks like?" "With your brother," Madame Cho said. "It only ever matters what it looks like." So-yeon smiled, the first real smile she'd worn all week. "Then let's make sure it looks like exactly what we need it to look like." The investigators were hired quietly. Cash payments, no paper trail, a private detective named Mr. Beck who specialized in exactly the kind of evidence that didn't need to be true, just believable. "I need photos," So-yeon told him. "Timed, angled, enough to tell a story." "What story?" "The one where my brother's wife destroys this family from the inside." Mr. Bach didn't ask questions. Men like him rarely did. He simply nodded, took his advance, and got to work. Jimin, meanwhile, was fighting a war his wife knew nothing about. He sat across from his father's old lieutenant, a weathered man named Park who had run logistics for the family for 30 years, in a back office that smelled like cigarette smoke and old paper. "The Yeosu route isn't the only problem," Park said, sliding a ledger across the desk. "We're 3 months behind on payroll for the dock workers in Busan. If word gets out, they'll strike. If they strike, every route we have left shuts down in a week. How much do we need to cover it?" Park told him the number. Jimin didn't flinch outwardly, but something in his chest caved in quietly. "I'll find it," Jimin said. "Jimin, Park's voice softened, the way it did when he'd known a boy long enough to remember him before he became a man carrying an empire. "Your father built this company on relationships, not just ships. People forgive slow payments. They don't forgive being lied to. If you're going to fix this, you cannot do it by yourself in the dark. I don't have a choice." "Everyone always thinks that," Park said, standing to leave, right up until the moment they realized they did. Jimin sat alone in that office long after Park left, staring at numbers that felt less like a balance sheet and more like a countdown clock. Meanwhile, the shipping company's collapse accelerated. Jimin took a call from his father's oldest business partner, a man named Choi, whose voice carried the particular weight of someone about to deliver very bad news. "Jimin, the Yosu route. We're going to have to pull out. Choi, we need that route. It's 40% of our remaining revenue." "It was 40%. Now it's a liability. I'm sorry." Jimin hung up and sat in silence for a long time. 40%. Gone, just like that. He didn't tell Annie that night either. Instead, he came home, kissed her forehead while she slept, and lay awake calculating how many more secrets he could carry before something broke. He had no idea Annie was about to become the solution to his problem, and that his own family was about to make sure he'd never find out. Annie noticed changes in Jimin, the distance, the late nights, the way he flinched slightly whenever his phone rang. "Talk to me," she said one evening, sliding onto the couch beside him. "You've been somewhere else for weeks." "I'm fine," Jimin said. "Just work stress. You know you can tell me things, right? Whatever it is." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Annie thought he might actually say it, might actually let her in. "I know," he said instead. "I just need to handle it myself." Annie didn't push. She would spend the rest of her life wishing she had. If you're loving the drama so far, make sure you're subscribed, because everything you think you know is about to get flipped upside down. By the end of that month, Mr. Beck had what he needed. Photos edited just enough to imply intimacy that never existed. Timestamps manipulated to erase the 15 other people who'd been in the room during those secret dinners. A narrative built brick by brick, waiting for the right moment to detonate. So-yeon reviewed the final folder with the satisfaction of a woman closing a business deal. "Perfect," she whispered. "Now we just wait for the right moment to hand this to my brother." She wouldn't have to wait long. Annie, meanwhile, spent that same week closing the final terms on the Yosu acquisition, unaware that the very meetings meant to save her husband's family were already being photographed, cropped, and quietly filed away as ammunition against her. "We're almost there," David told her, initialing the last page of a term sheet. "Board vote is in 9 days. After that, it's official." 9 days, Annie repeated, allowing herself for the first time in months to actually believe the plan might work. Jimin never has to know how close it came to falling apart. He just gets his company back. She had no idea that somewhere across the city, a folder with her face in it was already being assembled, timed, quite deliberately, to detonate before that vote ever happened. So-yeon chose her moment with surgical precision. Jimin had just come out of the worst meeting of his career, a room full of creditors politely explaining that polite was about to end, when his phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "We need to talk. It's about Annie. It's urgent." He almost ignored it, almost. But something in the wording, the deliberate urgency, made his stomach tighten before he even opened the folder she sent next. The first photo loaded. Annie, laughing, leaning close to David Osei at a candlelit table. The second, Annie stepping into a hotel lobby, David's hand grazing her back. The third, a grainy nighttime shot, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., Annie getting into a car with David, the two of them close enough that the frame could tell any story the viewer wanted it to tell. Thimon's hands went cold. "Where did you get these?" he called his sister immediately. "Mr. Beck has been tracking her for weeks," Se-yeon said, her voice carrying the practiced softness of someone delivering devastating news with great reluctance. "I didn't want to believe it either, Oppa. I know how much you love her. This doesn't mean anything. Business dinners, it could be. Business dinners at midnight? In hotel lobbies? Jimin, I love you, but don't be naive." He stared at the photos again. Every business trip Annie mentioned. Every late call he'd assumed was about supply chains and shipping manifests. His mind, already exhausted from months of financial collapse he was hiding from her, filled in the worst possible version of events with terrifying speed. "There's more," So-yeon said quietly. "There's a witness. Someone from her office. They'll talk if you need them to." Jimin didn't respond. He just stared at the photo of his wife's hand resting on another man's arm, and felt 3 years of trust collapse like a building with its foundation removed. But wait, here's where the story turns brutal. That night, Jimin didn't sleep. He sat in his study replaying every memory of the last 6 months through a completely new lens. Annie's late meeting. Annie's business trip to Busan. She came back from glowing about a new contract. Annie laughing at her phone during dinner, telling him it was just David being David. By morning, the man who once told Annie he'd survive anything as long as she was beside him had convinced himself she'd been lying to his face for months. He confronted her that evening, the scene that opened this story. "Are you cheating on me?" The photographs hitting the counter. The divorce papers. His mother's call, cementing whatever resolve he had left into something unbreakable. Annie's desperate insistence that the photos didn't tell the real story, that someone wanted him to believe a lie. "Someone wants you to believe I betrayed you," she'd said, looking him dead in the eyes. He signed the papers anyway. After Annie left that night, suitcase in hand, refusing to look back even once, Jimin sat alone in the apartment they'd shared for 3 years, and felt nothing like the relief he expected. He'd braced himself for anger, for vindication. Instead, the silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. He poured a drink he didn't touch. He stared at a photo of their wedding day still sitting on the mantel, Annie laughing at something just out of frame, and for one long moment he almost called her. His phone buzzed instead, a text from So-yeon. "Proud of you, Oppa. This was the hard thing, but it was the right thing." Jimin stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone face down on the counter. Something about the word proud sat wrong in his chest, though he couldn't yet explain why. The news didn't stay quiet for long. So-yeon made sure of that. Within 72 hours, a business gossip blog specializing in Korean corporate scandal, ran a story about the divorce and affair allegations. It spread fast, faster than Annie could have imagined. "Annie, we have a problem," her VP of Communications said, sliding her tablet across the desk. "3 of our Asia-Pacific clients have paused negotiations pending further review of leadership stability." "This is insane," Annie said, scrolling through headline after headline, twisting her business partnership into a scandal. "None of this happened. David and I have never, there's nothing here." "I believe you, but belief doesn't stop clients from getting nervous." Annie sat back in her chair, the walls of her carefully built empire suddenly feeling less solid than they had a week earlier. "Someone did this," she said slowly. "Someone planned this." "Who would want to destroy your marriage?" Annie didn't have an answer yet, but she was about to start looking for one. David found her in her office late that night, going through old calendar entries, cross-referencing every affair photo against actual meeting logs. "Annie, this isn't your fault," he said gently. "I know that. I need to know whose fault it is." She looked up at him. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steel. "David, look at this photo, the hotel lobby. We were there for the Busan Port Authority dinner. There were 15 people in that room." "I remember." "So why does this photo only show the 2 of us? Where did everyone else go?" David leaned over her shoulder, studying the image. "It's cropped," he said slowly. "Someone cropped this on purpose." Annie felt something cold settle into place. "Someone built this," she whispered. "This wasn't an accident. Someone constructed every single one of these photos to look exactly like this." "Annie, if that's true, this wasn't about an affair at all." "No," Annie said, closing her laptop with a decisive snap. "This was never about an affair. This was about something else entirely, and I'm going to find out what." David sat with her in silence for a while after that, the office quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Seoul traffic 30 floors below. "For what it's worth," he said eventually, "I never stopped believing you. Not for 1 second." "I know," Annie said. "That's the strange part. Everyone who actually knows me never doubted it. It was only the people who wanted a reason to doubt me who found one." "So what now?" "Now," Annie said, standing and pulling her coat off the back of her chair, "we find out exactly who wanted that reason badly enough to build it from scratch. If you're hooked right now, make sure that subscribe button is smashed, because the next part of this story is where everything gets turned completely inside out." Meanwhile, across the city, Jimin sat in his empty penthouse, divorce finalized on paper, but nowhere near finalized in his chest. He picked up his phone a dozen times to call Annie and put it down every time, his sister's voice echoing in his head. "Don't be naive." He didn't know yet that naive was exactly what he'd been, just not about Annie, about his own family. Annie thought the worst was behind her. She was wrong. 10 days after the divorce was finalized, her lawyer called with a tone Annie had learned to dread. "Annie, I need you to sit down for this." "I'm sitting." "What now?" "Jimin's legal team has filed a claim. They're seeking a significant portion of your business expansion. Specifically, the assets and contracts you developed during the marriage. They're arguing marital commingling of resources." Annie went very still. "They want part of my company." "Not part, a significant controlling interest in the Asia-Pacific division, the one you built with David." For a moment, Annie couldn't speak. 3 years of marriage, an affair that never happened, a divorce built on lies, and now they wanted to walk away with the one thing she'd built entirely on her own merit. And then, something clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. "That's it," she whispered. "That's what?" "The affair, the divorce. None of it was ever about betrayal. It was never about Jimin's feelings or his family's pride. It was a means to an end." "Annie, I'm not following." "They needed grounds," Annie said, standing up so fast her chair rolled backward. "They needed a reason to dissolve the marriage that would hold up in court, one that framed me as the party at fault. Because if I'm the one who betrayed the marriage, I lose leverage over anything built during it. This was never about love or jealousy." She looked at her lawyer, her voice hardening into something sharper than grief. This was a hostile takeover disguised as a divorce. That night, alone in her apartment for the first time since the papers were filed, Annie allowed herself 30 minutes to fall apart. Just 30 minutes. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, the way she used to when she was a little girl and her mother was still alive to hold her, and she let herself grieve everything at once. The marriage, the reputation, the version of her life she thought she was building. Then she stood up, washed her face, and called her lawyer back. "I want everything," she said. "Every record, every transaction, every name connected to this. If someone did this to me on purpose, I am going to find them, and I am going to make sure a courtroom hears every single detail." "Annie, this could take weeks, maybe longer." "Then it takes longer," she said. "I didn't build a company from nothing by giving up when things got difficult. I'm not starting now." Her legal team spent the following days pulling everything they could: court filings, corporate disclosures, the timeline of the divorce itself laid against the timeline of Annie's confidential acquisition talks. "Here's what's strange," her lead attorney said, spreading documents across the conference table. "The divorce filing came exactly 9 days before your company's board was scheduled to vote on final approval for the Yeshu acquisition. 9 days, Annie, not a coincidence. So whoever did this knew about the deal before the board did. Which means whoever did this had access to information almost nobody outside your company should have had." Annie sat back, the pieces already beginning to arrange themselves into a shape she didn't like. "There were only 3 of us who knew the full terms before board approval. Me, David, and our CFO. That's it." "Then either someone in your inner circle talked," her attorney said carefully, "or someone found another way in." Annie didn't sleep that night, running through every conversation, every email, every meeting where the deal might have been overheard. It wasn't until nearly dawn that she remembered the one detail that changed everything. A single dinner, 6 weeks earlier, where David had briefly stepped away from the table to take a call, leaving his laptop open on the screen for less than 2 minutes. A dinner at a restaurant where, she would later confirm, Han family security had also been dining that same night. But wait, here's where it gets even darker. Annie spent the next week barely sleeping, diving into every record she could pull. Phone logs, travel itineraries, security footage from the hotel lobbies and every affair photo, financial transactions tied to the timeline of the scandal. What she found didn't just clear her name, it exposed a conspiracy. "David, look at this," she said, spinning her monitor toward him at 1 a.m., surrounded by takeout containers and empty coffee cups. "This payment, $50,000, routed through 3 different shell accounts, landing in the account of a man named Baek Sun-woo." Who's Baek Sun-woo? A private investigator, specializing in surveillance and, according to 2 former clients I found through a forum, narrative construction. Annie's jaw tightened. That's a nice way of saying he fabricates evidence for a living. Who hired him? Annie clicked to the next document. Banking records requiring 3 days, 1 very expensive forensic accountant, and a favor from a friend at a regulatory agency to obtain. The payment originated from an account linked to Han So-yeon. David sat back slowly. Jimin's sister. Jimin's sister, Annie confirmed. She hired a man to fabricate an affair, destroyed my marriage, tanked my reputation across 3 continents, and now her family's lawyers are trying to seize the division I built from nothing. Annie, this is bigger than a family feud. This is fraud. Financial fraud, at minimum. Possibly more. Annie stared at the screen, feeling something shift inside her chest, grief hardening slowly into resolve. "They picked the wrong woman to underestimate," she said quietly. What Annie didn't know yet, what she was about to discover in the most painful way possible, was exactly why her business expansion had become such a threat. Because the truth was so much bigger than jealousy, bigger than a family protecting its pride. The truth was that Annie had been quietly building something that would have saved the very family trying to destroy her. And once that truth came out, nothing about this war would look the way anyone expected. If this story has you saying, "Wait, what?" comment part 2 below right now, because trust me, you're going to want the rest of this. Annie closed her laptop that night with one thought looping in her mind. They didn't destroy me. They just handed me the evidence to destroy them. She had no idea Jimin was, at that very moment, starting to ask the exact same questions. To understand why Annie's business partnership had become a target worth destroying a marriage over, you have to go back 4 months, to the night Annie made a decision she never told Jimin about. "David, I want to buy the Yosu route," she said, sliding a proposal across the table during what was supposed to be a routine strategy dinner. David nearly choked on his water. The Yosu route, as in the Han family's collapsing shipping route. The one bleeding money faster than they can cover it. That one. "Annie, why would we buy a failing asset?" Because it's not failing because it's a bad route. It's failing because it's mismanaged and underfunded. The infrastructure is solid, the port relationships are solid, What's missing is capital and modern logistics software, both things we have in abundance. David studied her for a long moment. This isn't a business decision. This is personal. Annie hesitated. It's Jimin's family, David. If that route collapses completely, it takes the whole shipping division with it. Do you understand what that means? Hundreds of employees, decades of legacy. And Jimin, she stopped herself. Jimin would lose everything he spent his whole life trying to protect. Does he know you're doing this? No. And he can't know. Not yet. Why not? Annie exhaled slowly. Because Jimin's pride would never let me save him directly. If I offer help, he refuses it. If my company quietly acquires the route and restructures it, brings it back to profitability, keeps his people employed, keeps his name on the letterhead, he gets to keep his empire without ever knowing his wife was the one who saved it. That's an enormous risk, Annie, financially and personally. I know. And if this ever gets out before the deal closes? Annie didn't have an answer for that. She should have. That night, she called her grandfather's old business partner, a woman named Ruth who had mentored Annie since she was old enough to sit in on board meetings. You're doing this for love, Ruth said, once Annie explained the plan over the phone. Not for strategy. Is that a problem? It's not a problem, baby. It's a risk. Love makes people generous. It also makes people blind. You're about to hand a struggling company a lifeline and hope nobody notices you're the one holding the rope. What happens if they do notice, and they don't like what they see? Then I deal with that when it happens. Ruth said, in the particular tone of a woman who had lived long enough to know exactly how that sentence usually ended. Just make sure you keep records of everything. Every wire transfer, every meeting, every signature. If this ever turns into a fight, you'll want the truth documented before anyone gets the chance to rewrite it. Annie didn't think much of the warning at the time. She would think about it constantly in the months that followed. The plan was elegant in its quiet generosity. Annie's company would acquire a controlling stake in the failing shipping route through a series of confidential negotiations. Negotiations that required exactly the kind of late-night meetings, hotel lobby conferences, and business dinners with David that would later be twisted into evidence of an affair. The rescue would save thousands of jobs across the shipping division, restore the route to profitability within 18 months, allow Jimin to remain the face of leadership publicly unaware of who orchestrated his family's survival, and protect 3 generations of the Han family legacy from total collapse. Annie wanted to give her husband's family something priceless, survival, without ever asking for credit, recognition, or control. She never anticipated that someone inside that family would see the deal not as salvation. But wait, here's the twist that changes everything. Seo-yeon had discovered the negotiations months earlier, not through loyalty or concern, but through her own private surveillance of the family's finances, motivated entirely by self-interest. If Annie's rescue succeeded, Seo-yeon understood something her brother never considered. The deal would give Annie enormous informal leverage over the company's future. An American outsider, married into the family, quietly becoming its financial savior. Annie wouldn't need to ask for control. She would simply already have it. And more terrifying to Seo-yeon than anything else, if the rescue went through, the family would owe its survival to a woman Seo-yeon had spent 3 years trying to push out. She cannot be allowed to save this family, Seo-yeon told Mr. Beck during their final planning meeting. Not because it fails, because if she succeeds. So the affair, Mr. Beck said slowly, it was never about jealousy. The affair, Seo-yeon said, was about timing. I needed the marriage destroyed and the assets seized before the acquisition could close. Once the divorce is finalized and the courts award us the disputed interests, we absorb the deal on our terms, and Annie Carter gets nothing. Not credit, not leverage, not my brother. It was never personal jealousy dressed as strategy. It was strategy dressed as personal jealousy. Annie discovered the full picture, piecing together bank records, deal timelines, and Seo-yeon's suspiciously perfect knowledge of confidential negotiations that only 3 people were supposed to know about. She knew, Annie said quietly, staring at the evidence spread across her desk. She's known about the acquisition since the beginning. That's why the timing of the affair allegations lines up perfectly with our closing schedule. David sat across from her, equally stunned. She destroyed your marriage to steal a deal that would have saved her own family. Worse, Annie said. She destroyed it to make sure her family never had to admit they needed saving. Pride over survival. Every time. Annie sat back slowly, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. I wanted to save them without anyone knowing, she said. Now everyone's going to know exactly what I tried to do, and exactly what she did to stop it. If you're feeling that plot twist rearrange your brain right now, comment part 2 and hit subscribe. Because we are just getting to the good part. Annie had her evidence. She had her motive. What she didn't yet have was proof that would hold up in a courtroom against a family with unlimited resources and zero conscience. She was about to get exactly that, from a source she never expected. Her own husband. Jimin had signed the divorce papers. He had not signed away his ability to think. 2 weeks after the finalized divorce, sitting alone in the penthouse that had never once felt empty until Annie's absence made every room echo, Jimin found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, going back through old records with the same discipline he once used to audit failing shipping contracts. Something about the photos had never sat right. He'd been too destroyed to notice at the time. Now, in the silence, the inconsistencies screamed at him. The hotel lobby photo, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., had a shadow on the wall clock behind Annie that didn't match the hour on the timestamp. He pulled up weather records for that night. Rain, heavy rain. But the photo showed dry pavement outside the lobby windows. That's not the same night, he muttered to himself. He kept digging. The witness his sister mentioned, someone from Annie's office willing to testify, turned out, after a single phone call from a private investigator Jimin quietly hired, to be a former employee Annie had fired 8 months earlier for expense fraud. A man with every motive to lie and none to tell the truth. Then came the payments. Jimin's forensic accountant, a man he trusted from his father's era, found something buried in a shell account that made his stomach drop. Jimin, the accountant said carefully over the phone. This account, it's tied to your sister. Show me. $50,000, paid to a private investigator named Baek Sun-woo, 6 weeks before your divorce was filed. Jimin closed his eyes. Send me everything you have. Before he confronted anyone, Jimin did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the family cemetery outside the city, where his father's headstone sat beneath a row of pine trees, and stood there in the cold for almost an hour before he said anything at all. I don't know how to fix what I broke, he said finally, his voice cracking against the silence. You always told me the family comes first. But what if the family is the thing that's broken? What do I protect then? The wind answered him with nothing but the sound of branches moving. Jimin knelt, pressed his palm flat against the cold stone, and let himself cry for the first time since the divorce. Not for the marriage he'd lost, but for the version of himself that had signed those papers without asking a single hard question. When he stood back up, something in him had hardened into resolve. I'm not going to let her be the only one who tells the truth, he said quietly. Not this time. But wait, here's where the guilt turns to fury. Jimin confronted Seonyeon that same night, slamming the folder of evidence onto her kitchen table with a force that rattled the dishes. Explain this, he said. Seonyeon barely glanced at it. Explain what? Don't, Jimin said, his voice dangerously low. Don't do that. $50,000 to a man who fabricates evidence for a living, paid 6 weeks before you handed me photos of my wife's affair. Explain it. Appa, I don't know what you're talking about. Stop lying to me. His voice cracked through the room. I lost her because of what you gave me. I need to know if it was real. So-yeon's composure finally slipped, just slightly. Does it matter anymore? The divorce is finalized. What's done is done. That's not an answer, that's a confession. She said nothing. Her silence told him everything her words refused to. Jimin went to his mother next, the folder still clutched in his hand, his voice raw with a betrayal he hadn't yet fully named. Did you know, he asked her directly, did you know So-yeon fabricated evidence to destroy my marriage? Madame Cho's face remained composed, but something behind her eyes flickered. Your sister was protecting this family. From what? From Annie? Annie was never a threat to this family. Wasn't she? Madame Cho's voice sharpened. Your wife was quietly buying our failing shipping route out from under us, Jimin. Behind your back, behind all our backs. What was that if not a threat? Jimin stopped breathing for a moment. What did you just say? His mother realized her mistake half a second too late. The Yeosu route, Jimin said slowly, pieces slamming into place with sickening speed. Annie's company. The acquisition rumors I dismissed months ago because I thought they were just market speculation. Jimin. She was buying it to save us, he said, his voice breaking. Wasn't she? That's what all those meetings were. That's what the hotel lobby was. Business dinners with David Osei, negotiating a deal to save my family's company. And So-yeon found out and destroyed it before it could close. Madame Cho said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence, again, was the only confirmation he needed. He sat with that silence for a long moment, then said the thing he'd been circling for days. "You didn't just lie to me," he said quietly. "You used me. You knew I'd believe anything if it came wrapped in fear for this family. You didn't need proof. You just needed me, desperate enough not to ask for any." Madame Cho's composure finally cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "Everything I have done to protect what your father built." "My father built a company on trust," Jimin said. "You just spent it all trying to save the money instead." He left before she could respond, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the pull to turn back and smooth things over. Some doors, he was beginning to understand, weren't meant to be reopened. They were meant to be walked through, once, and left behind. If your jaw is on the floor right now, subscribe and comment part 2, because you have not seen anything yet. Jimin sat alone that night with the full, devastating shape of the truth finally in front of him. He hadn't just lost his wife to a lie. He had actively, personally participated in destroying the one person who tried to save his entire family, while his own blood orchestrated the betrayal from the shadows. He picked up his phone with shaking hands and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 weeks. Annie didn't answer. He didn't blame her. He tried something else instead. He called David. The line was silent for a long moment after David picked up, long enough that Jimin wondered if he'd hung up. "You have some nerve," David finally said. "I know. Do you have any idea what she's been through? What your family put her through?" "I know, David. That's why I'm calling. I need your help." "Why would I help you?" "Because you care about her," Jimin said. "And because whatever happens next, I don't want to be on the wrong side of the truth anymore." There was a long pause. "What do you need?" "I need to know what she has. I need to know what my sister did. And when Annie's ready to use it, I need her to know I'm not the enemy anymore." David exhaled slowly. "I'll talk to her. That's all I can promise." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even trust. But it was a door left slightly open, and for the first time in weeks, Jimin let himself hope that might be enough. He wasn't going to stop trying, because somewhere in Seoul, Annie was putting together the final piece of evidence that would expose So-yeon completely, and Jimin intended to make sure that when it happened, he was standing beside her, not against her. The asset hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, held in a private civil court reserved for cases where powerful families preferred discretion over spectacle. Jimin's family arrived first. Madame Cho in a black tailored suit, calm as marble. So-yeon beside her, scrolling her phone with the casual confidence of a woman who believed the outcome had already been decided in her favor. Their legal team, 3 lawyers deep, carried folders thick enough to bury an ordinary opponent. They believed victory was inevitable. Annie walked in 11 minutes later. She wore navy, not black, a small, deliberate choice. Black would have looked like mourning. Navy looked like control. She carried a single folder, thin, almost unremarkable compared to the small library the opposing counsel had wheeled in. Jimin, seated beside his mother out of obligation rather than loyalty, noticed the folder immediately. Thin, confident, nothing like a woman preparing to lose. Something in his chest tightened. Hope, maybe, or dread. He couldn't tell anymore. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with David a week earlier, the careful, guarded promise that Annie would handle things her way when the time came. He'd spent 7 days wondering what that meant, whether it meant she'd bury his family quietly or bury them publicly, whether there was any version of this hearing that ended with them still speaking to each other once the gavel came down. He glanced sideways at his mother, whose hands were folded so precisely in her lap they looked carved from stone, and at So-yeon, who hadn't looked up from her phone since they'd sat down. Neither of them seemed to feel what he felt. This low, persistent hum of dread that told him the ground beneath their family was about to shift in a way none of their lawyers had prepared for. The judge called the room to order. Opposing counsel began methodically, laying out the claim, marital commingling of business resources, assets developed during the marriage subject to equitable distribution, a controlling interest in Annie's Asia-Pacific division that rightfully belonged, at least in part, to the Han family estate. It was airtight, on paper. "Mrs. Carter's counsel," the judge said finally, turning toward Annie's side of the room. "Does the respondent have anything further to submit?" Annie stood. The room, which had been humming with quiet legal formality, went very still. She lifted the folder. She looked at Seoyeon first. A long, unhurried look that made Seoyeon's confident posture falter for just a second. Then she turned to Jimin. Not with anger, not with the desperate need to be believed that had colored her voice the night he handed her divorce papers. Just steady, certain. Yes, Your Honor, Annie said. I'd like to show the court who actually committed fraud in this case. Soyeon's face lost every trace of color. Madame Cho's hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Jimin turned slowly in his seat, looking at his mother, his sister, and finally at Annie, the woman he had signed away in a moment of manufactured rage, now standing taller than he had ever seen her. The judge extended a hand. Approach. Let's see what you have, Mrs. Carter. Annie stepped forward, folder raised, the entire courtroom holding its breath around her. If you've made it this far, comment part 2 right now, because trust me, you are not ready for what's inside that folder. The bailiff took the documents from Annie's hand and passed them to the judge's bench. Jimin watched his mother's composure crack for the very first time in his entire life as the judge began turning the first page. Your Honor, Annie said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, before this court decides who owes what to whom, I think it's important everyone understands what actually happened 3 months ago, and who paid $50,000 to make sure it never came to light. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Soyeon's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something urgent she didn't appear to hear. Whispers rippled through the small gallery of assistants and observers seated behind the lawyers' tables. Madame Cho reached for a glass of water with a hand that trembled just enough for Jimin to notice. Soyeon's phone, forgotten now, slid off her lap and clattered against the floor. She didn't move to pick it up. Annie remained perfectly still at the center of it all, folder now resting in the judge's hands, her expression unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to read it. Jimin had, he recognized it instantly, the same calm she'd worn the night she stood in their kitchen and told him someone wanted him to believe a lie. She hadn't been performing composure that night. She'd known the truth even then. She just hadn't had the proof yet to make anyone else believe her. Now she did. Jimin's heart pounded. Whatever was in that folder was about to change everything. For his sister, for his mother, for the marriage he'd thrown away in a moment he would spend the rest of his life regretting. The judge reached for the folder. The room fell utterly silent. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, comment part 2 if you want the courtroom fallout and reunion arc, and subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops.